necessarily like sharing about my personal life during a sermon. My presentation's running off on me. I don't know why. But I can't deny that it does help me to convey concepts to you all. So I'll start with another, you guessed it, personal story. I was a pretty stellar student from kindergarten, let's say, through second grade. I was really good. And I was always in like the fast group, you know. So, for instance, I had reading groups in my first grade classroom, right? And there was the Cardinals, the Sparrows, and the Blue Jays. Each group would have different reading times with the teacher. And all of us kids would, of course, after we were done, we'd talk about, hey, where are you guys in the book? You know, are you guys this far? Are you guys that far? And I soon figured out that I was in the Blue Jays, which was the fast group, you know. So I was considered one of the more advanced readers. For some reason, things changed for me in third grade. I don't know, you know, I think maybe I started getting more distracted by TV, video games. As a result, I started struggling more in school. One area that I probably struggled the hardest in was reading comprehension. It was like, I just could not, for the life of me, read a paragraph and recite what I just read. I just couldn't do it. You know, and that was really evident when my teacher, she made us do these things, right, where I had to like comb through if you remember, a paper newspaper. I had to find an article to read, and I couldn't do sports. I don't know why. They just wouldn't, like she said, no sports allowed. It's like, why can't I do sports? And so I had to cut out the newspaper, and then write a report on it. And I just couldn't do it. Like, it just was so boring. It was so hard, right? So, you know, like I said, I struggled so much when it came to reading comprehension. And I bring this up today because the passage today requires us to have very sharp reading comprehension skills. My favorite store. Can you guess what it is? No, it's Costco, okay? That's my favorite store. But one of the common complaints that I hear about Costco from, I call newbies that shop there, is that, oh, I hate going in there because my receipts are so long, and like I buy everything in the store and it ends up being like $800. And you know, thankfully when I go to Costco, I don't have that problem, you know, because I go in, I get my brown eggs, I get my oatmeal, and I get my kids' fruit pouches, and I'm like very laser focused when I go, right? So that's what we need to be today. We need to be laser focused when we read this passage, because this passage today is going to have so many branch off points, and if we're not careful, we're going to miss what this passage really is about. Okay, so for the past 3 months, right, we've been going through 1 Corinthians. I know for the past couple of weeks we haven't been, but we're getting back on that now. And we can see that Paul's addressing several issues, right, that comes up in the church, in the Corinthian church. These issues include dividing over church leaders, tolerating incest, bringing lawsuits against one another, excusing sexual immorality, marriage, singleness, divorce, eating food offered to idols. So looking at this list of issues, I think it's fair to say that we can see how the conclusions of these passages can lead to some relatable application to our lives, right? In the modern time. And that brings us to the seventh issue. And I know up to this point, you've all just saying, yeah, you know, I can't wait to get through all these issues. They're all just so relatable to my life. And the Bible is truly living and breathing in today's time. And we get to the issue of head coverings. How do head coverings apply today, right? But before we get onto the passage, I just want to remind you again the importance of reading comprehension, okay? We need to stay focused. We need to extract the main point from this passage. So I'm going to go ahead now and read the passage. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 2 to 16. Now I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions, even as I delivered them to you. But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head, but every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. Since it is the same as if her head were shaven. For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But since it is disgraceful for a wife to cut her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. For a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God. But woman is the glory of man. For man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. That is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. For as woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman. And all things are from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is a disgrace for him? But if a man has long hair, if a woman has long hair, it is her glory. For her hair is given to her for a covering. If anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the churches of God. Lord, just help us to understand what this passage means, and use me, your imperfect servant, Lord, to just be your tool, your instrument to inform the congregation, to convict them, to read your word, to meditate on your word, to love you. Lord, I just ask that you just use me again, and just be with us during this time. Holy Spirit, fill this place. We love you and praise you in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so Paul here starts off by saying that he's congratulatory of the church, right, the Corinthians, for just maintaining the traditions. The traditions can also be understood as teachings, right? So it seems what Paul is doing here is that he's giving them credit where credit's due. He's doing a good job, right? They weren't doing everything horribly. They took the teachings to heart, it seems, and so that tells us that the church wasn't completely forsaken. But now we move on to verse 3. Though this church was maintaining some of the traditions, they were perhaps loose when it came to the issue of head coverings. Before I go any further, I just want to take a moment again to emphasize the importance of reading comprehension, okay? Because this verse 3 is the key to understanding the main point of this entire passage. I know you thought today that you'd be coming away with finally answering the question of whether you should bring a head covering to church or not, or maybe if you've read a little bit ahead in the passage, you're going to find what the meaning of what because of the angels means, or maybe you just wanted to know what the head covering was. Maybe you want to know if it was like a beanie or if it was like some sort of like Kentucky Derby hat or something. But it's my conclusion that after reading this passage multiple times, and I watched a 7-hour YouTube video on this passage on the topic of head coverings, that the head coverings is a secondary issue in this passage. In other words, it's not the main focus of the passage. Verse 3 helps us to frame this passage in the appropriate context-driven manner. So Paul lays out what appears to be the order of submission, or another way of seeing it is the order of authority and subordination. Okay, so Paul wants them to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of a wife is her husband, the head of Christ is God. Bear with me to this one point, this next part here. To understand this verse, we have to understand, I believe, what the Greek word for head is, which is kephale. And you probably didn't know this, and I'm not doubting your guys' ability to understand things. I'm just saying you have other things going on in your life, and that's good, But there is actually a raging debate, okay, on this word kephale within this passage. The debate's not so much about the translation. Most scholars believe that kephale does translate to the English word head, but the question is, should we as an English speaker understand the word head we see as metaphorically referring to like a ruler or like a chief, or should we understand head literally as like a source, sort of like saying like the head of a river, right? The head of a river, where the head doesn't imply any kind of authority, it just kind of describes literally the source or the origin of a river. And believe it or not, this is a raging debate within people that talk about this passage a lot, that are very passionate about head coverings. And I'm going to spare you all the deeper citations that, trust me, there's a lot of them, and tons of research papers about this, but I think that without even seeing all those research papers, okay, you're going to see that source is problematic as a translation, because if we translate it to source, right, then that would kind of mean that the source of every man, it's the source of a wife/woman is her husband or man, and the source of Christ is God. Now, going back to Genesis 2, we can perhaps say that, Eve was taken from Adam. So, yeah, maybe that could be true. Like, okay, yeah, maybe a woman is sourced from a man. But we cannot say that man was physically taken from Christ, right? Nor can we definitely cannot say that Christ was sourced from God. He wasn't taken out of God the Father, right? Because Christ, we know, existed eternally with God the Father. So that's wrong, and that's wrong, right? And we know this because Colossians 1:17, it says, he is before all things, and in him all things. John 1:1-2 says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And he was in the beginning with God. We know that Christ had to have existed eternally because he is God. Philippians 2:6-7 says, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. We see here then that it's problematic, okay, to say that kephale can be translated here in this context as source, because we just can't say that God is the source of Christ. And I suppose, one could say that Paul was using two different meanings in the same sentence here, so he'd be talking about headship when it came to Christ and God, but then he was talking about source when it came to husband and wife, man and woman. But I just think it's unlikely that Paul would be switching the meanings, mid-verse. Okay, a good student may ask, well, has the word kephale been used elsewhere metaphorically to mean some sort of like authority, right? In other words, has it been used as the headship form? So when Paul's talking about God establishing Christ's position, in Ephesians 1, he says, and he put all things under his feet and gave him as head over all things of the church. Also in Ephesians 5:23, Paul, when talking about the husband-wife relationship, he says the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Paul talks about the preeminence of Christ in Colossians 1. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. Again, in Colossians 2:9-10. For in him the whole fullness of deity dwells bodily, and you have been filled in him who is the head of all rule and authority. And I know what you're saying. Why is this important, Matt? Why are you spending so many of my brain cells on this topic, right? Like I mentioned before understanding this part about head coverings, you have to understand verse 3. It sets the framework, the mindset for this entire passage, okay? We must understand and acknowledge that Paul is starting this passage with an illustration of a hierarchy that further emphasizes the concept of submission and authority. Perhaps he knows that this is an issue in the church, okay, and that the head coverings are an outward sign of a misunderstanding of this idea that the Corinthian church was perhaps displaying. And let's just talk about what's authority for a moment. Authority, what is authority? Let's just define it as having the power to exert command, rules, influence. What is submission? Let's just say it's to yield or surrender oneself to the will of the one who's in authority, okay? Before I continue, I want you to just receive this skill, okay? Do not read more into the text than what it just says very plainly, right? Allow me to recite this verse one more time. I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. In this verse, it says nothing about what a person's worth is or their status or their essence, right? This verse plainly says that authority exists. That's all it says. And it has no relation to one's status or their essence, okay? Now, why do I feel the need to say this? Because I think that the natural tendency is to then extend this definition of authority and submission by saying that, if one person's higher than the other, then that makes them better, right, than the one under submission. And, actually, that could be said, that could be true sometime, right? I mean, because it's true in the case of God and man. God is definitely better than us. We're inferior to God, right? And he also so happens to be in authority to us, and we're in submission to God, right? I don't think that's controversial, okay? And I'm tempted to deviate into New Age beliefs about how we can be God if we try. I'm just not going to do that, though, but I'm really tempted to. I really want to do that. I'm not going to do that. We as Christians believe that we are not God, okay? We can never be God. God is God, man is man. Now, it's also possible to have the case where the submission and authority going on between two equal entities without having any effect on the superiority or the inferiority of the other. That's the case when we talk about the relationship between God, the Father, and the Son, Jesus Christ. And that's also the case when we talk about the relationship between fellow humans. Okay, let's go back to Philippians 2:6-7. Who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. Jesus was equal with God, yet he submitted to the Father. Jesus, while on earth, was submitting to the Father's plan. For I have come down from heaven, not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. And Father, if you're willing to remove this cup from me, nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. I believe it's clear then that the Father and the Son were equal, and yet the Son submitted to the Father's will, or the Father's plan, right? So I'll give an example. When I worked in the movie theater, yeah, I gave that last time, right? But I got promoted twice, okay? I was promoted once from floor staff to box office supervisor, okay? So I got to wear like a nicer tie. And then I finally got promoted to chief of staff. And while I ascended the ranks, okay, and had authority over the floor staff, they were no less equal than me as far as their worth goes, okay? They still deserved to be treated with respect, even though I was, quote, higher than them, okay? So what have we established? Authority and submission, or in other words, subordination, that principle exists in this world. It applies to both cases where the essences of entities may be equal or they may not be equal. God and Jesus are equal essence, and authority and submission, that principle exists there in that paradigm. And man and women are equal in essence, and authority and submission also exists. These are two they're independent, they're orthogonal, they're not mutually exclusive. I don't know, whatever you want to call events. They're just not, they don't care about each other, okay? So before we move on to the riveting head covering section of this passage, you have to know the reason for the direction to wear the head coverings in the first place. The reason is because, as you'll see, it served as a visual marking of submission that was understood by those in the church and the culture at the time. There's also a debate. If you notice, I'm reading from the ESV, and it talks about husband and wife, but other translations, most of them talk about man and woman. And this is because the Greek for woman or wife is einer, and the Greek for husband and man is, the other way around, is gein, and man and woman is einer. And it could be used interchangeably, and I really want to get into this, but I just don't have the time. But it could go either way. Let's just put it that way. But I think that because the context of this passage is not, I don't think it's really about marriage, it probably still applies to all men and women in the church, okay? So before we continue on again, if you get one thing from today's passage, I hope you don't walk away talking about should or should we not wear head coverings, okay? But I know that that's fine, it's fun to talk about, so it's okay. I'm not gonna say you're wrong for that or anything, but it's just, I hope you understand this principle of authority and submission. Okay, so verse 4. So Paul says here that every man who has his head covered in this context of praying and prophesying dishonors his head. And now I sense that some of you are imagining, what kind of head covering is he talking about, right? And I ask that you trust me when I tell you that knowing what this head covering is doesn't alter the point of the passage, okay? It doesn't really matter. But since I believe some of us are curious, I was curious, right? We can quickly go through what some have said is this head covering. Some have said that hair, if you go to verse 15, you skip ahead to verse 15, you'll see Paul saying that if a woman has long hair, it is her glory, for her hair is given to her for a covering. well, that seems to be like, oh, straightforward, that's her hair, right? So then the implication would be that, Paul had an issue with women perhaps lowering their hair during their service. So he was commanding them, you need to put your hair up, cover it up, right? And I won't go into them here, although I really want to, but I can't. But there are some arguments to be made that this is the case. But there is one problem, I think. And to me, this is fairly convincing, right? The reason is that if the covering was hair, it would mean in verse 4 that men could not have hair when praying or prophesying. They just had to be bald, and I'm just not sure this is right. But again, there's many debates about this, okay? So if it's not hair, what is the covering? Well, there is some evidence to suggest through, ancient statues or just paintings or just some history that was recorded at the time that pagan men, when going into a temple of worship, would pull their toga over their head, right? And so the logic goes that, okay, if Christian men were to do the same thing back at the time, they would be kind of imitating the pagan culture around them. So maybe Paul's telling them that, in order to be different from the culture, you need to remove that head covering, right? Because we want to be different. So I think that based on these two views, I think that probably the covering is some sort of physical covering. It's not just hair. But, what really matters here is that Paul is simply saying that a man who covers his head during praying or prophesying, it dishonors his head. Okay, that's really all this verse is really trying to say. So you don't really have to know what the head covering is or even why, but I think that it's definitely possible just to accept that fact and move on. There's just a lot of things we have to accept. You don't have to understand everything, right? My wife, she makes me go buy these bag salads from Costco, and she just uses the lettuce inside of them, and she doesn't use the fixings inside of it, like the Caesar dressing and the croutons, and I don't really understand it, but I just accept it, okay? That's fine. So on the flip side, though, in verse 5, a woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it's basically the same as shameful as if her hair was completely shaven. That's what Paul's saying. And we'll get into why that's bad in verse 6, but the bottom line is that this just wasn't seen as a glorifying state for women to be in, right? Paul's drawing a contrast here. He's saying it seems that it's appropriate for a man to do something with his head uncovered, but for a woman, it's appropriate for her to do something with her head covered. So in other words, man, covered head, bad. Uncovered head, good. And for a woman, covered head, good. Uncovered head, bad. That's very simple, okay? And it's not really clear from what I learned why women were not covering their heads in church, but I suppose the point really is that they just weren't, okay? Some have said that I've read that, not having a head covering meant that you were not under a man, so whether it be a husband or your father. So in other words, what it was showing is that it was an outward sign of non-submission for these women to not wear their head coverings. And Paul's telling them basically, you just need to keep it on, okay? Paul makes the statement that if you women are not covering your heads, it's equal to just having your head shaven. And you might say, well, that's an odd thing to say, What's so bad about a woman having a shaved head, right? Well, verse 6 may clarify that a little bit. A shaved head, Paul seems to equivocate not covering your heads with a shaved head. And so he says that if you're not going to cover it, then you might as well just go all the way. And you might as well just shave it, And this is probably not the most wholesome example. I'm not encouraging this next slide, okay? But, just imagine, if you know anything about Texas Hold'em or poker, right? It's it's kind of like a poker player, he just keeps steadily raising his wager, right? And, at a certain point, you're just giving up all your chips. You might as well just go all in, right? Why even bother? Just go all in, right? But, so when you're about to put in all your chips, just go all in. But since we've established, though, that a woman having a shaved head, having a shaved head, though, back in the day could have meant that a woman was either, in mourning or, it was a sign of being perhaps a prostitute, right? So Paul basically says, it's not going to be good if you do that, so you might as well just cover your head up again. So going back to the poker player example, one could say, well, if you go all in, it's super risky, so you might as well just pull back and just fold your cards, right? And, I get that analogy kind of breaks down but hopefully you'll sort of understand Paul's argument better here. You don't have to understand why he's drawing this analogy, but I would suggest to you that if you just accept what Paul is saying by telling yourself, okay, I'll see where you go with this, Paul, He's saying, hey, you ladies not covering your heads, this is like, it's like this bad. This is really bad, okay? Since you might as well just go on ahead and just put that covering back on, okay? Bottom line is that men should not cover their heads and women should cover their heads because women, it was sending a bad sign to those around them. And just when you thought Paul was done, he's not done, right? Of course, then he goes into verse 7, says he goes into creation, right? Another reason for why should be used as a symbol for showing the creation order, right, and the roles. He says that a man should not cover his head since he is the image and glory of God, and that woman is the glory of man. And what does it mean that man is the image and glory of God, right? What does that mean? One of the better ways for us to try to understand, to determine the meaning of words in verses is to just see how it's used in other verses, right? And it's better to even go to the same author, right? Because it's like Paul wrote glory. Why not just go to what Paul wrote about glory in other places, right? So we see he uses glory again in verse 15. He says, does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is a disgrace for him, but if a woman has long hair, it is her glory, for her hair is given to her for a covering. So perhaps we can say that the usage of glory here, that maybe disgrace or dishonor is like the opposite of glory. So then we can say then that maybe glory has something to do with honoring. And we can maybe say that the one who does the honoring is the same time the glory of that person. So Paul just seems to make a connection between glory and the creation event of Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve, when they were created, they had different ways of honoring God. Okay, so in Genesis 2:15, the Bible says, the Lord God took the man and put him in the garden of Eden to work and keep it. So the point here is that God had given Adam a role, a way in which Adam could show honor and glory to God by tending to his creation. And at this point in Genesis, there was no other person. It was just Adam, right? And later in Genesis 2:18, the Lord God said, it is not good for man should be alone. I will make him a helper fit for him. And as we know, God made some initial helpers, but none were really suitable until he formed woman from Adam's rib. And many commentaries state, and I think it's true, that what it shows very simply is that God had given man a role and to care and to work his creation, and woman was given a role to help man in that creation. I don't think that's saying anything controversial, right? I mean, I used to go to this one dentist's office, right? And there used to be like a dentist that would take the water picker high-speed tool and like kind of clean your teeth. And then there was a dental hygienist that would also kind of sit there and use the suction tool and suction all the water out, right? And, I'm oversimplifying the hygienist's role, okay? But they do way more than that, I'm just saying. But I don't think there's anything controversial about what I just said, right? All I'm really trying to point out here is that there's one that does the work, the objective of cleaning the teeth, and there's one that helps that person clean the teeth. Just like in creation, there was one that was given the role to tend to the creation. There was one that was given the role to help him. That just means that simply man honors God in a unique way that woman doesn't. I hope that makes sense, And so let's hold that thought about glory and let's move on to the image. What does it mean that man is the image of God? The verse doesn't mention that woman is the image of God, okay? But it also doesn't say that they're not made in the image of God. And in fact, if we turn back to Genesis, we'll see very clearly that it's written that woman was made in the image of God. It says, then God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. So Genesis shows that men and women have different roles, okay? And one can say that God has given man a unique role in how to honor him, and that was just not given to women. And you'll see in the following verses that Paul uses this reasoning, okay, to explain why woman is the glory of man. So why is woman the glory of man? She was made from man. not the other way around, where man was made from woman. And also, man wasn't created for woman, but woman is created for man, okay? Emphasizing the fact that woman was given a unique role to help man. Now, doesn't this imply, I guess, that men had a mission that was given to them to complete, and woman was also given a mission to help him complete that, right? Wouldn't that seem to imply then, in that case, that male is the leader while the female was the helper? It says nothing about who's more capable, okay? I mean, a woman, I think more often than not, is way more capable than a man. And actually, if you from that perspective, it kind of makes sense, right? Because it's like a woman is helping this incapable man, right? Because they're more capable, right? So, summary, Paul cites that creation roles. He cites that creation as a reason for why women and men should have a different role when it comes to the head covering or not covering your head. And I'll just say that, maybe it doesn't have to really make sense. It's just his reasoning. It just is what it is, okay? You have time, trust me, you have time to wonder after the sermon why this was the case, but I just think at the end of the day, you may find it's more fruitful for you to just acknowledge that Paul's making this argument, okay? And so now he gives another reason for why women should have a symbol of authority on their head. It's because of the angels, okay? Because of the angels. And man, if I had more time, I'd love to go into whether the Greek word for authority, exousia, should be translated symbol of authority or authority, but I just don't think I have. I'll just have to reach for the condensed version here, okay, and just say, at the end of the day, I believe that the symbol of authority or authority, depending on your translation, just refers to the covering, okay, very simple. And then also, I'd love to talk about what because of the angels means, but I just don't think I have that much time. But, the short version is that the Greek word angeles, it can refer to angelic beings, or it can actually refer to people. And so either way, Paul's he's conscious of how the church practices this head covering practice, because it's in front of these either human messengers or angels. But I personally just think that angels is a better translation, okay, but I don't have time to really go into that. Okay. Now in verse 11, he says, in the Lord. Oh, no, some may say that after reading verse 7 and 10, right? That it may give men some reason to subjugate women, okay? Or exert total domination and control to the point of abuse. And Paul may kind of catch on to that. He seems to understand that tendency, perhaps, right? So in response to that, he puts some guardrails against that kind of mentality, that kind of abuse. He says, in the Lord, women are not independent of man, and man isn't independent of woman. This is further emphasized because though in verse 12, woman was originally made from man, men are now born of women, okay? So basically he's saying that men and women are related to each other, they need each other, they're interdependent, right? By the way, verse 12 is kind of a reason why the husband and wife is not applicable here, because, I'm not born from my wife, right? I'm born from a woman. Anyways, so now Paul goes into another reason for why head coverings need to be observed. He's already established that men and women should observe the practice differently. And now he reaches for the natural way. Okay, we see that men and women they have men and women differently as support. He reaches for the natural way for why women and men should look different and how that applies to head coverings. So first, Paul says, given all this, do you believe that women should stop wearing head coverings while praying? Paul claims that nature shows is a disgrace for man to have long hair. But what does nature mean? Okay, the Greek here for nature is phusis, which can mean the regular or established order of things. In other words, a man having long hair goes against the way things ought to be. And I know there's fighting words. Eric Fan not here today. Eric has long hair, but it doesn't mean that men, if you have long hair now, or women, you have short hair, that you need to either grow it or cut it to a certain length. Because honestly, if you ask me what that length is, I just don't know. Okay, so don't ask me. So That's not really what it's saying, I think, but generally what it's saying is that men need to look like men and women need to look like women, right? In contrast, a woman's hair, it's her glory, right? So that sounds really nice, doesn't it? I mean, Paul says that a woman's hair was given to her as a sort of covering. So you might as well just put that covering on, right? Since your hair is already covered with your hair. And I don't believe that the covering that's referred to here, again, is the covering that we've been talking about this entire time, because it seemed to imply that men had to be bald, right? So it just feels awkward also the whole time that you think you're talking about a physical covering, and then he just kind of tells you the last verse, like, oh, by the way, this is what the covering is, right? But the point is that women were given long hair to cover their heads, where men just don't have long hair, all right? And then finally, in verse 16, Paul says that every other church does it this way. So you're on your own if you don't observe this practice, right? Okay. Well, how do we apply this, right? Well, I think clearly the first application is that the Bible acknowledges two different sexes, okay? Head coverings back then showed that having different rules, the head showed that there were different rules or roles for each gender, right? The church back then was obedient to that principle of submission, headship, and authority. And the head coverings may have been seen as a reminder, maybe even to themselves, that we need to keep this practice intact of having separate roles, right? It even served as a visual to the outside world that, we observe this principle. So while the head coverings in this passage is a little strange, I think what's not strange or unclear is that Paul is teaching that men should adorn themselves in one way and that women should adorn themselves in another way. I don't think this is cultural either, In other words, I don't think that the principle of acknowledging the two sexes with different roles was only for the culture at the time. The examples used here for why men and women are to be different, they're what's called transcultural principles. Where were these transcultural principles used in this passage? Well, authority and submission, right? God the Father, Son, and Jesus Christ. It was creation was used, Adam's direct role and Eve's supportive role. Nature, women should look like women and men should look like men. All these examples are not dependent on the culture at the time. They are, as I mentioned, transcultural, meaning that they're applicable throughout whatever culture you're in, no matter what time you're in. So the gender differences, I think, through these examples that I just listed, should be maintained. And they were maintained at that time. And, actually, what I've heard is relatively recently, head coverings were used to show that the practice of head coverings was kind of a universal thing in the church until relatively recently, right? I think in the 20th century, there was a campaign against head coverings. It was seen as kind of like a male patronistic ritual, right? So, but is that enough reason to continue or to resume wearing it? I'm not sure, right? So that brings us to the next question. Are they for today? And the short answer is, it depends, okay? So bouncing off that idea again of principles that are transcultural, and we have to ask ourselves, is this practice of head coverings transcultural or cultural? If it was transcultural, then that would mean that no matter where or when, the practice of head covering should always be implemented. I'm not saying that's absurd, mind you, okay? I'm just saying that that's what the implication is. It would mean that, let's say you found this church in a remote area that just perhaps doesn't wear many clothes, right? That based on this passage then, Paul would be telling that culture, you need to actually wear head coverings when you do praying and prophesying. Again, I'm not saying that that's absurd, I'm just saying that that's what the implication is, right? I'm just not sure if that's really what Paul would say. And I know it's kind of a dangerous thing to say, but I'm willing to be corrected on that, right? However, does your church practice head coverings? If your church already practices head coverings, then, and everyone in the church sees it as a sign of submission, then I would say, yeah, you should continue to wear the head coverings, right? I think it's, again, the decision to wear or not wear the head coverings is based on the premise that the surrounding culture sees it as a sign of submission, right? If the culture now doesn't see it that way, it's still relevant. More or less, I've mentioned that more or less the practice kind of died in the earliest history of the 20th century. But again, is that a reason to resume wearing it? I'm not sure. We have to remember what the head covering was for. It was something it had something to do with your outward appearance, right? Demonstrating that you were submissive to God or to your husband, to man. If we don't see a head covering in that manner anymore, I just don't know if it's applicable to us in CCCTO. Paul was addressing an issue during his time in which the practice of head coverings were directly related to an outward appearance of submission, authority, and headship, right? Let's just take our church. Can we honestly say that, I think it's fair to say we're a non-head covering church, right? Is it because of our lack of obedience to the concept of headship? I mean, again, if you're a woman, right, not wearing a head covering right now, which is only, I see one person wearing a head covering, okay, that's fine. And no coincidence here, right? But if you're a woman not wearing a head covering now, is it because you were intentionally being insubordinate to your husband or to a man? Maybe not. I don't think so. And from Mike Winger, he's a YouTube Bible. It's called Bible Thinker on YouTube. He was the source of this passage today, this sermon. He says that Paul never argues for the meaning of head coverings. He never says, this is what the head coverings mean. It's a transcultural thing. He argues for their use in a way that's entirely dependent on the meaning. He assumes their meaning for the sake of what he says. The meaning is never taught. It's part of the cultural background. It has meaning to the culture, but it has no meaning. What Paul does not argue for or teach explicitly is not something the passage is teaching, but it's just something that's in the background, okay? In every reason for the head covering, you'll find that the head covering was actually just the application of the transcultural principle. Remember, I just talked about that, right? All cultures did it back then, however, not all cultures do it now, right? Creation order and the headship principle is transcultural for sure, but the head covering, that was the application to that principle. And nature, with respect to hair length, that is transcultural. So yeah, women looking like women and men looking like men, that is transcultural. But the head covering was just the application of understanding that you understood that principle, right? So what are ways then, right? What's our head covering now, okay? What are ways in which our church can still maintain this gender role distinction if we're not a head covering church anymore? There must be other ways in which our outward appearances show whether we are submitting or not. The passage is somewhat directed towards married couples, and some have said that perhaps wearing a wedding ring for married couples is a way that nowadays to show we're in submission. And by taking it off, if I don't have this anymore, I'm kind of saying, I'm available, right? And it's like, it's not sending the right signal, right? Or some would say that dressing modestly, perhaps, is a way to show that nowadays it communicates a sort of submission to your husband or your wife. But I think that maybe many of those examples just kind of fall short a little bit of the head covering, It was a unique way. So I'm going to step away from physical appearances. I'm just going to talk about attitude. Okay, is your attitude illustrative of an obeying spirit to God? Perhaps to your husband, right? Me, perhaps to God. Since I'm a husband, I'll just address husbands, right? Are you submitting yourself to God, God's will, so that your wife may say that they're able to trust you, right? In my marriage, I know this is surprising, we fight, and the world tells me, perhaps through my secular friends or coworkers, how I should handle quarrels. It's like, hey, you got no right being disrespected. You got to defend yourself against these attacks, right? Or you're going to take that from your wife? And, I think a disobedient, world-led spirit would in fact repay evil for evil, right? But this is exactly what the Bible speaks against. And so my point is that it's to be obedient, to be an obedient man, to be an obedient husband of Christ. I believe like when I'm wronged, I'm called to help rather than demand what's like fair or what's justice, right? What's right for me. Matthew 5:38 says, just do not resist the one that's evil, but if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And then Paul says in Romans 12:17, repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. Are we showing this attitude towards one another in our church, outside our church? Or are we just listening to the world with how to deal with confrontation, right? This is just one example, okay, of what it means to submit, for me to submit to God rather than submitting to the world, right? God had every right to deal with you and me and his whole sinful creation. He had the right to destroy. He has the right still to destroy every one of us, right? But we're sinful, right? But God chose mercy and he chose grace. He chose compassion on his creation one last time. This is the time we're living in. If you don't know that, do you know that now? Have you accepted Christ now? He did this. He gave us one last chance by sending his perfect, unblemished Son, Jesus Christ, the last one who deserved to bear the wrath of the Father. If God can do that for us, why can't we do that when I feel wronged, when we feel wronged? I know we're getting kind of far off from the head coverings. I get that, okay? But remember, this passage is not about the head coverings. It's about showing your submission and understanding of the one whose authority you're under. And as Alistair Begg said when preaching on this topic, the first issue is what's going on inside your heads rather than what's going on top of your heads, okay? And so it's my hope then as a church that we'll think of ways to honor God so that the world may see us as a church that not only understands and accepts submission and gender roles, but in addition, loves and honors what God teaches us here. Lord, that was a lot. It's a confusing passage, probably better for a Sunday school class, but yet it's in your word and it deserves to get preached on. Lord, I pray that if we still have questions at the end of this passage, we'll talk about it amongst ourselves and with others in the church here. And I just pray that at the end of reading this, that we just understand that the important concept, principle, is to know that we're under you and that we preserve gender roles in this church, and that may that be a clear sign to the world that we are in submission to your word and to your commands, Lord. Help us, again, come away with this, with just loving you and your word more. And if we don't, Lord, help us to find ways to do that, Lord, because at the end of the day, we know your word is true and you're true. And help us to love what's true. Thank you again, Lord. We pray all this in your Son's name. Amen.
Thank you, Matt. And let's rise and let's sing our response.